Back to you, Brittany.
Okay. Welcome everyone. My name is Chuck Feinberg. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And we are an organization, People of Faith from Maryland, the District, and Virginia. And our mission is to challenge the ways prisons are operated in our area, especially in the jurisdictions I mentioned, and to change the culture of prisons from being primarily about punishment to rehabilitation and healing. So that's kind of what we focused in, and our major issue has been for the last 7 years now to end the abuse of prolonged isolation or solitary confinement in area prisons. And so we've been involved in Maryland and Virginia with legislation in both areas, in different kinds of bills, some successful, some less, and a little less involved here in the district, but are also very interested in what's happening in the district. And so we decided to have we have regular programs that we do online. We often interview returning citizens and speak about their experiences, as well as other advocates and authors who have written important books about different aspects of criminal justice. And so tonight's topic is criminal justice issues in the District of Columbia. There's a host of them, from the gun violence in our district, in the district, to the conditions at the DC jail, to the halfway house, the federal halfway house in the district, to expungement of criminal records for people. So there's a whole host of issues. We've asked a leading advocate, Patrice Sultan, to address some of the top issues she thinks that we should know about. And Patrice is an expert person to deal with that. She's an attorney, a professor, and an advocate, as I mentioned, and she's been involved in many important community groups and commissions on criminal justice. For instance, the Jails and Justice Reform Task Force, to the Police Reform Commission, to the Criminal Court Reform Commission, and she's been involved in all these. So she has an insider's view of some of how this goes down and the politics of it, as well as being an outsider of being a leading advocate. And she's a founder of the DC Justice Laboratory. Is that right? I've got it right. Looking for the right Justice Lab, right? Not laboratory, Justice, DC Justice. She's the founder of the DC Justice Lab, and she'll tell us more about that as well. So we welcome Patrice, and I ask everyone except Patrice to mute.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinberg. It's been great working with you since we launched DC Justice Lab on so many different issues, including those you touched on. Parole was another one I know we were in conversation about, all of the things Rethink Justice is working on together, and so many of the issues facing people who are incarcerated or living under threat of incarceration in our city. I apologize, but Brittany, I lost screen sharing capabilities somehow, and I just wanted to ask if you could let me share my screen to walk through a couple of slides here while we talk about what's going on in the district. And just by way of background, I'll tell you a little bit about DC Justice Lab. So I was a criminal defense attorney in DC for many years, did some civil rights litigation as well. And outside of my practice, I was dabbling in policy work here in DC around issues like decriminalization of marijuana, changes to our policing statutes, and some other sort of piecemeal legislative reforms. And I was invited to work on a much larger scale legislative overhaul, and that is the rewrite of the DC Criminal Code. And I left my practice to do that work. In the course of of developing some expertise around what is a really nerdy skill set to have, right? Drafting statutes. I decided I wanted to rewrite a lot of statutes, not just the substantive criminal offenses and penalties, but the laws that govern how police operate, the laws that govern how jails treat people, the laws that govern how people are prosecuted, the bail to jail part of the system, which is where I get a lot of my energy. And so DC Justice Lab was actually born a little bit earlier than anticipated. We launched in the summer of 2020, which was about 6 months before I finished my work on the revised code. And that was because of all of the energy and attention around transformative changes to policing in the United States. I'd never before in my career seen so much support for taking giant leaps and thinking about really huge changes in law. And my students' interest in that made me want to launch DC Justice Lab early. So I will speed through some of the slides about who we are and what we do. You can learn a little bit more about us on our website. But we essentially are a very quickly growing organization of folks who are working on rewriting all of the laws that I just mentioned. And we really take a harm reduction and pro-healing approach to solving these community safety problems. So we think about state violence on par with other kinds of violence like interpersonal violence and community violence. And we try to move the district away from using state violence as a response to community violence as often as we do that. And that includes anything from the most extreme version, like solitary confinement that Rabbi Feinberg mentioned earlier, to the initial police encounter or surveillance even that people don't necessarily know about. And what we're imagining is a district that no longer subjugates people who have a history of being involved with the criminal legal system here, and instead treats people like people and thinks about them as individuals. And we see a lot of line drawing in all of these policy spaces, including spaces that are only people who are returning home from incarceration. There's still this sort of attitude toward how do we draw distinctions between people who committed violent offenses versus nonviolent offenses, or sex offenses versus non-sex offenses, or people who were of a certain age, or people who were of a certain wealth or income. And really, until we move the conversation to talking about everyone at once, we're going to find ourselves hitting stumbling blocks and having a much more difficult time reaching that vision that we talked about of treating everybody alike. So for those of you who are joining us through the Zoom call as opposed to on YouTube, I wanted to ask you a few questions here. All right, so over a 5-month period, just before the pandemic, DC finally complied with a law that was passed 4 years earlier and counted up the number of police stops. They did this for the last 5 months of the year. How many police stops do you think the Metropolitan Police Department counted? And this is just, you can unmute, you can type in the chat, but we're talking just about the Metropolitan Police Department, not the other dozens of agencies that operate in our city.
I'll interrupt. What do you mean by a police stop? Would you define that a bit? So.
Yes. So by police stop, I mean a civilian police encounter that was initiated by the officer. So this is not a response to a call for service. This is the police initiating an encounter with a civilian. So it could be in traffic or it could be a pedestrian on the street. Anyone want to venture a guess? No penalties here. We ballpark.
I'll give you one.
Thank you. We got a 5,000 guess. Anyone else? 100 per day.
300.
300 per day. We got 63,000 stops over a 5-month period. That is an awful lot of stops. And if you think about your daily experience in DC and can say to yourself, wow, I've never been stopped, or I went an entire year without being stopped, understand how concentrated that police activity is in certain parts of our community. Our criminal legal system in DC is almost entirely Black, almost entirely poor, and almost entirely Native Washingtonians. And they bear the brunt of the police civilian interaction that we're talking about. As the city is being gentrified, which we know is happening in DC and Los Angeles more than is happening anywhere else in the country, that police force is weighing even more heavily on the remaining few people who identify as part of that demographic. Next question, what percentage of people sentenced for felonies in DC are Black? I gave you a hint by saying it was the majority, but what percentage do you think it is? And this information is from the DC.
I think I know the answer to this, but
you know this one?
I think it's like 97%, something like that.
Close, yeah.
It's huge, no?
It's 94% of all the
Yeah.
felonies that are
Yeah,
sentenced.
okay, so
The number that you're thinking of is the people sentenced to incarceration. So if you're looking at
Yeah.
our BOP data or our
Yeah.
DOC data on a given day, it is
Yeah.
higher. So this includes people who are sentenced to
Sounds
terms
close.
of
That was close.
supervision. Yeah, very close. And it also, you know, that 6% also includes people who have other or where the race information was not counted. If we look at our juvenile legal system, the commitments in a given year toggle between 98 and 100% Black for certain years. And then if we think about spending, how much do we think is spent on supervision? So this is CSOSA. This is the agency that supervises people who are awaiting trial or supervises people who are released on probation in DC. Ballpark for how much is spent.
Well, and you might want to note to people that there are how many different supervisory agencies there are in the district. I bet
Sure.
people don't even know that.
Yeah, so our pretrial services agency is technically housed inside CSOSA. So this budget includes both the pretrial and the probation, but we have separate supervisory agencies for people who are charged with juvenile delinquency. And we have separate, we have the United States Parole Commission still, unfortunately, playing a role in DC justice
And
as
do you
well.
count CSOSA in this?
Yeah, so this is CSOSA's budget.
Yeah, right.
Any guesses? Is it in the hundreds of dollars?
Millions
Billion.
of dollars.
Millions. Yeah, over 200 million per year. It was 250 for a while. Things slowed down a little bit during the pandemic and we're still at over $200 million per year. Yeah, so a lot of times when I talk about our system, I say that, you know, it's way too big, it's way too Black, and it's way too expensive for us to continue in the fashion that we've been moving in for so long. And so we think about these really huge changes in law. So if we are rewriting the expungement statute, instead of saying we're going to amend one piece or amend 2 or 3 provisions, we said, let's start over and rewrite the entire chapter and let's sit down with returning citizens and oftentimes students who are interested in this work and write the bill language together and rethink it sort of like top to bottom, the entire provision in law. So I had the fortune of working on 3 different reports that were released last year. One was the Police Reform Commission's report with 90 recommendations for how policing could be revamped in the district. This has the first half about where investments need to happen to reduce crime, particularly gun violence in the city. And then the back half of the report, which is where I spent most of my time, was on what we do about state violence and how do we limit the authority of police to aggravate harm as opposed to reduce harm in our communities. I worked also on the task force on jails and justice, which released a report last year. It was an implementation plan with 80 recommendations on how DC could decarcerate by half within 10 years and bring everybody home from the Bureau of Prisons. So for those of you who don't know, everyone in DC who's sentenced to prison time leaves the District of Columbia and goes miles, oftentimes hundreds or thousands of miles from home into the Bureau of Prisons system. And that implementation plan does have some recommendations that overlap with the Police Reform Commission's recommendations. A lot of the decarceration recommendations are relating to creating off-ramps at every stage in the system, from before there's any police contact to after a person has served a number of years in prison. And then the third piece that I worked on was the one that I was just talking about, which is the revised criminal code. That effort is now on the council's desk as a bill that's being considered this year. And I'm happy to share out the links to each of these documents and all of that I can give to you, Rabbi Feinberg, at the end of the presentation, if that's helpful. I can also share some of these things in the
Great.
chat.
That'd be great. I also have some of the links, but if you could send them all together, that'd be great.
Sure. So we have gotten to work trying to turn these proposals into policies. And, oh, sorry, was there a question? Oh, okay. And so working with students beginning in the summer of 2020, they started looking at policing. And so these were the first set of reports that DC Justice Lab came up with. And each of them, as you'll see, really puts limits on the authority of police. And our other provisions sort of do the same thing: limits on prosecutors, limits on prisons to inflict harm. And the idea here is that we really live under the Supreme Court's interpretation of our federal Constitution and the amendments to that Constitution. And oftentimes the Supreme Court doesn't reach certain issues or certain fact patterns. And even when they do, there's an opportunity for states to raise the floor, right? For us to think about how can we do even better than the federal Constitution. And in a lot of states, that has happened through their own state constitution. But in the District of Columbia, the sort of equivalent of that, our Human Rights Act, doesn't really confer a lot of new rights except for, an equal protection clause kind of right that hasn't been litigated in the criminal context very often. So happy to share out links to each of these different reports, but some of them have already been turned into bills. So for example, there is a bill pending in front of the DC Council right now that would limit police authority to interrogate and search children without giving them the right to counsel. There is a bill pending to limit car chases through the city after we've seen a number of fatal encounters between Metropolitan Police Department vehicles and pedestrians and drivers in our city. And we also have the expungement provision that I mentioned before, which is not policing specific, but is another one that is sitting there in committee right now that we're really proud of. At the end of Black History Month this year, we held our first safety summit, and we walked people through a number of provisions. There are dozens and dozens of other changes in law I want to see, and these are the ones that my team got me narrowed it down to in time for that event. And so really there are 9 different things that are sitting in front of the council right now that we're worried could die in committee before the end of the year. Those are listed on the left. And then there are other things that we've fully researched, fully written, and are ready for any council member to introduce at any time. And those are listed on the right. And so just wanted to share those lists with you so that you know that you can reach out to ask us for more information. You also can take action on any of these because they were part of the safety summit. So if you go to safeandfreedc.com, you'll see a long Google document that has a page for each of these bills. And on each page, you can see where each council member stands on each piece of legislation. And there's a handy tool on the right-hand side that allows you to quickly tweet at, email, or call those council members to either thank them for their support of these changes in law or ask them where they stand on it right now. And so this is something that we're really excited about because it was the first of its kind sort of pro-Black or Black-led public safety agenda in DC. And part of what we're trying to do this year is really break down this false binary of sort of victims being in one camp and people who have caused harm being in another camp, and understand that we're one community and that what we're trying to do is embrace things that are evidence-driven, embrace things that we know are going to reduce harm overall. And that includes harm caused at the hands of government actors. And so with that, I wanted to open up and see if there are any questions from people who are here on the Zoom, and I will start putting things in the chat for folks who are interested in seeing more.
Okay, I'll call on people. I'll start out with John Schukert.
Well, I put it in the chat also. How many localities, states, and so forth have already eliminated solitary confinement?
The United States is really far behind. So we're part of this national campaign called Unlock the Box, which has 19 jurisdictions. And the first really meaningful solitary bill that was passed was the HALT Act in New York, which was just last year. And implementation of that hasn't been the greatest yet. We have seen some bills pass one house or both houses in the last several weeks in other jurisdictions, but we're really on the forefront and pioneering new ground in the United States to be talking about banning solitary confinement or limiting it in the way that the United Nations says it should be limited. And that sort of marker of 14 days is one that makes more sense in states that have both jails and prisons than in a place like DC, where all we have right now are jails. And so if you think about the number of people in our jails who aren't even there for 14 days total, that's not really the right line to draw here. And so the bill that we're working on for solitary confinement in DC is stricter than what you'll see in New York and New Jersey and other places. There are also individual wardens and individual institutions that have tried out reductions in the use of restrictive housing and seen some really positive results. Maine is a striking example where the incidents of violence inside the facilities and recidivism both appeared to go down as they used solitary confinement less and less. And DC is on the sort of extreme end of this. We're the only jurisdiction that locked down the entire facility for nearly 500 days during the pandemic under the guise of being a medical lockdown when people were not at all receiving medical treatment or care. And so I would say this is really kind of like fertile ground and new ground that's being broken here. I wish I had better examples of places that had really banned this already and implemented it fully, but I am very hopeful that in the next few years, we'll see a dramatic shift on those policies.
So we've been active both in Virginia and Maryland. And so in Virginia, we had a really significant solitary bill, limit solitary to 15 days. It got through the Senate 2 years in a row. And this year, it didn't die in the House, but the House decided that they wouldn't vote it down, but they would instead vote in a study bill, which of course, drove us nuts, the fact that they needed to study this again. But we were able to, several of our advocates will be on the commission that studies solitary. So we're hopeful that maybe we have a little wiggle room in Virginia, even though there has been a shift in the political climate there. Let me turn to John List now. Yeah.
Patrice, thank you for this. I have two questions. If you're successful at the DC Council, does the federal government have it? I mean, is that within the bounds of home rule and that's the end of it? Or can the federal government somehow intervene in any of that? And my second question is the recent DC budget in any way supportive of the various initiatives that you have?
Thank you for that question. To clarify the first part, are you talking specifically about solitary or all of our efforts?
Well, I don't all of it, I guess. Yes.
Yeah.
All.
So I'll give you a very lawyerly answer, which is it depends. So for some of these things, we do have to worry about congressional interference with our ability to move forward. And some of them are easy to do with no fiscal impact whatsoever. And then we also are kind of always on our back foot to some degree because Congress can mess with our funding in other ways that makes it difficult for people to exercise rights that they're given under DC law. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? One more time.
The recent budget, if they finished it at the DC Council, how do you view that? I guess is the general question.
Sure. So the biggest, well, really two issues that came up quite a bit during the Budget Support Act hearing yesterday that bear directly on our work are police-free schools and protections for excluded workers. So there were excluded workers who were looking for, $160 million to make sure that they were not left out of this pandemic relief budget. And there was not a lot of success there at the council, but there certainly was a lot of success in the demonstrance space, right? In terms of social action and bringing people together around certain ideas. This is the most attention I've ever seen given to excluded workers. And I think it's been a really positive partnership between like workers' rights and talking about things like the criminalization of street vending and how we see these intersections between our criminal legal system and our workforce and labor markets here. Police-free schools is something that the council had already said it would phase out between now and 2025, that we would move away from having SROs with guns inside our schools. And the mayor put the funding for SROs back in her budget that was sent to the council. And it was a really tight vote yesterday, but the council amended the mayor's budget in that regard and agreed to continue phasing out police officers in favor of putting supports in schools like counselors, nurses, social workers, and others who we know have demonstrated over time can prevent harm and promote healing in ways that armed police officers inside the building walls cannot. So that was a really big win, and we're pleased to see that. And it's directly supported by the Police Reform Commission's recommendations. Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, John, you want to go ahead again? Yeah. Did you have another question? Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, just quickly, what is the percentage, if you know it, of in DC of African Americans on the police force?
When the Metropolitan Police Department often touts that their racial composition looks a lot like the city. So the city has been between 40 and 50% Black while I've lived here. The police force similarly has been between 40 and 50% Black since I've lived here. But when you understand that most of the people being policed are Black, the police force certainly doesn't look anything like those demographics. We would have to have a police force that's 85 to 95% Black for it to actually mirror what's happening in the city. So I think it's a little bit misleading that at the front of each of their annual reports, at the front of their stop data report that we had to fight so hard for them to even publish, they really highlight how many Black officers they have in a way that I think suggests that most interactions with police are with Black police officers. We also don't see a lot of difference in terms of how people are treated necessarily based on the race of an individual officer. I have seen some studies showing that the race of the police chief makes a difference in the number of complaints of excessive force and profiling. But in DC, this is the first time we've had a Black police chief in a while. And so we'd be comparing, sort of more than 10 years ago and now to the period in between, if we were to look at that here. I'm happy to answer any other questions if you all want to follow along.
Let's talk a little bit about the politics of all this. You have all these ambitious plans and these goals to change. Who have you identified? I sometimes throw up my hands in some despair because I feel there's so little political leadership on most of these issues. So I was wondering if you found some really good politicians who will be supportive of a lot of the measures that you have written about and that you've come up with.
Thanks for that question. I think it shocks people to find out that in a city that is supposed to be the most progressive, that is the most highly educated, that there's the most shared viewpoints when we do a lot of public opinion polling and that kind of thing. And in a place where we don't have a bicameral legislature, right? We just have a council of 13 people and 7 people you need to agree on something. So little moves by way of transformative changes to our criminal justice system here. And even with the bills that I mentioned that have been introduced, those were introduced over a year ago and they've just been sitting there. And so when we talk about leadership, we're not just talking about people who are going to go to the community meetings and say how much they care about harm reduction, or people who are going to send out a newsletter to their constituents every week that says public safety is top of mind. We really need people who are willing to take a lead on introducing these measures, on insisting that they are marked up and voted upon on making sure that people who are directly impacted by this stuff are brought to the table, not just tokenized on the back end to come testify, but really part of the legislative drafting process. And that, I think, remains to be seen. We're getting closer to the end of this council period. A lot will happen in the last 6 months of an election year, but we'll see what leadership really looks like, I think, in between now and the end of 2022.
Yeah. Well, where do we stand with expungement? And maybe talk a little bit about that particular issue, because it's been on the back burner anyway for it seems like some time.
Yes, so the expungement bill is really well done. I'm so happy with how it turned out. It was the first proof of concept that I could sort of translate this new skill into working directly with people on the writing part. And we rewrote the entire chapter, as I said, but there are 3 other bills that sort of tinker at the margins of the problems with our current sealing and expungement scheme. DC's system for record sealing and expungement is uniquely complex and restrictive. We have a lot of barriers to people being able to clear their records, but even before we get there, it's so complicated that most people can't tell whether they're eligible or not without hiring an attorney. And so this dramatically simplifies the sealing process. It provides an avenue for actual expungement, which doesn't exist under current DC law, and it automates a lot of the record sealing and expungement so that people don't have to file a motion depending on the disposition of the case. So we've got a ton of people with publicly available criminal records for things that were not even papered, where no charges were even filed, where people were not guilty of what they were accused of in the first place. And a lot of those things we think should be automatically sealed by the clerk of courts instead of a person having to file a motion and the court having to take time to decide it. So if you look on the safeandfreedc.com document and scroll down to the Restore Act, would love to see some tweets around that bill and making sure that the council understands how important it is to pass that bill unchanged instead of doing what we see happen a lot, which is pulling a whole bunch of parts from a whole bunch of different bills, cobbling together sort of a Frankenstein omnibus version of that bill, and satisfying no one and leaving us with another chapter that's unworkable and inconsistent. And so that's the message I'd really like people to leave with if you care about people being able to get access to jobs and housing, is we want the Restore Act passed unchanged without being watered down or
So
broken
what's
out.
going to take to move something like that so that it gets actually passed?
I think it takes hearing directly from people who live in the city, right? They've heard from people who are returning citizens, but they need to hear from people who are hiring. They need to hear from people who are faith leaders. They need to hear from people who are, looking to support people returning home and being able to compete in this job market after the pandemic recovery happens. And so that sort of chorus of voices, I think, is what's most important, because right now we're not worried about people agreeing that this needs to happen. We have a lot of co-sponsors on this legislation. We're worried about it either being dramatically watered down or it dying in committee because it didn't make it to the top of the list of things that are most important to finish before the end of the year.
So some more public support for this, basically.
Please, yes.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, good to know.
What was the website you said to go to? DC something?
It's safeandfreedc.com, and there is a link for you in the chat, the first one that I posted there, and you'll
Okay.
see a table of contents, and this one is called the Restore Act,
Okay.
Restore
Thank you.
Amendment Act of 2021.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe you could comment a little bit about IRA and people who are convicted, I believe, as teenagers for long sentences, and because this affects a number of our pen pals. We've gotten a lot of number of questions about that. So
Sure.
you could fill people in a little bit about that.
Just an overview of what
Yeah,
the
and a little bit about the nitty gritty of how people go about. So people sometimes get questions in their correspondence about it. So Be helpful
Yeah.
to know more about it. Yeah.
So the basics of eligibility are that things have changed over the course of 3 bills. So what you heard a while ago might not be true now. And that is initially there was legislation where people who were under the age of 18 and had served 20 years or more would be eligible for second look sentencing. And then it was changed to 15 years of waiting period. And then it was changed to people under 25 years of age. And that's what makes it such a significant change in law. And DC is the first to do that. So if you have a pen pal who was under age 25, which a lot of people who were locked up that long ago were locked up under age 25, and they've served 15 years of their sentence and they're not currently awaiting a parole determination, they may be eligible to file to have their sentence reviewed, not by a parole board, but by a sentencing court. And these sentencing hearings are really robust. What's been interesting to me is, a lot of the kinds of evidence and expertise that are brought into these hearings, when people are thinking about who a person is and what punishment is fitting, is missing at the initial sentencing phase that we see people going through every day in our superior court. And so it's really a great illustration of what are the things that matter, what's the information that the court needs about the individual, about the person who was caused harm, and about the community that they want to return to. And that's the part that I really like to emphasize a lot is 15 years isn't just giving us insight into how a person develops over time. It's giving us insight into how we as a community develop over time and what opportunities have we created for people to reduce harm, and what services have we made available to people who are in need of care. And so I think that's just as good a reason to go back and look at all sentences, not just those for people who are under 25 years old, but people who have served a significant period of time. And so you may have heard things floated at 10-year mark for all people at the federal level. That's Cory Booker's version of second look that's been proposed before. And hopefully that's the direction that we'll see others around the country move in, following our lead.
And how easy or challenging is it to apply for this if someone is, has served that time and wants to have the come before the sentencing commission?
So they don't go to the sentencing commission, they go to their actual sentencing judge, and it is an intensive process. So there are a number of factors laid out for the court in the statute that have to be addressed in detail. And some of what takes time is finding out what documentation you can bring to bear to show how a person has done while they were in prison. And you can imagine trying to get a snapshot of what someone's life looked like in 1996 or in 2001 is not a very easy thing. And so sometimes it takes investigating outside of the prison and talking to people that they were interacting with to really get a picture of who they are. We also see a lot of experts brought in to talk about a person's wellness and what plans are needed for them outside of a custodial setting. And we also see a whole lot of work done around what the reentry plan would look like. Where will this person live? What are they going to do to earn a living? How are they going to be able to be successful? And the Second Look project works on a lot of these cases directly. They're also a wealth of information more generally for people who want to learn more about IHRA. And one thing that I'll be working on with NVRDC this year is thinking about what Second Look looks like for people who are victims of crime, and they have a right to appear at these hearings, and they have a right to have an attorney help them navigate that process. And so I think more can be done for people to understand the process, not just for the petitioner, but for everybody who's affected by these decisions.
So does the petitioner need an attorney?
The petitioner is the person who's been serving the time. And yes,
Right.
I would think they need an attorney to do it effectively. I mean, the same as at the pretrial phase, right? It's rare that it makes sense, in my view, for someone to to represent themselves, but there is a right to self-representation in criminal cases. And there are circumstances in which that is the right course of action for some folks. But I
Yeah.
think that the statute is a difficult one to navigate without the benefit of counsel. And I think the investigation that needs to take place is really hard to do from the inside the walls.
So that seems to limit the number of people who could really have access to the process. Am I right about that?
Well, the clearinghouses that have been set up, I think are operating pretty efficiently. So through both Georgetown Law and Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, people are being matched with attorneys pretty
see.
efficiently. So I would encourage people to reach out to John Anderson at PDS if you know someone who is trying to find out if they can be matched with a lawyer.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah. Okay, so there are there are legal resources available then.
Yes. And I saw Mr. List raising his hand, I think.
Well, you've kind of touched on what I was going to ask about, because in the Pen Pal program, we frequently get communications asking, I'm on the inside, how can somebody help me, process paperwork about, parole or second look or any of those sorts of things. And, I think the BOP facilities are supposed to have somebody available. I don't know how well it functions, but we've just heard about that, okay, I know about this, but how do I, get in?
Yeah, it's so tough to disseminate information to people who are sent out into the custody of the Bureau of Prisons. I think, to the extent that you can let people know about the Public Defender Service or the Second Look Project as a resource, they're really responsive that way. And if you ever run into a problem where the only barrier is that somebody doesn't have the money to make a phone call or something like that, please feel free to reach out to DC Justice Lab. And although we don't do direct representation, we want to help solve for those kinds of systemic barriers to access to justice. So please let me know if that ends up proving to be a burden or a barrier.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thanks.
More questions or comments?
Patrice, maybe you could remind me of who your basic cohorts are in the sense of other organizations that you work with.
Yeah, so it depends on the issue, but we really like partnering with a lot of the organizations that are led by people who have been directly impacted. And so you see a lot of partnership with us and National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens and an abolitionist collective called Harriet's Wildest Dreams. Those were the two organizations that co-sponsored the Safety Summit that I mentioned earlier today, and we work with them often. The organization that led the way on police-free schools is called Black Swan Academy, and they work directly with young people. They're doing incredible work. Both that organization and National Reentry Network do both the policy work and the direct services work. And we're all now office mates as of a couple weeks ago. We're all in one building together, which is a cool little incubator space for our organizations. And there are so many others that I don't know where to start without leaving someone out. But we follow and share a lot about our partners on social media. So even if you're looking at our Instagram page and see the people that we follow, it's a good kind of directory of who's doing what in DC relating to public safety, either directly by touching on these policing, prosecution, punishment issues, or indirectly by solving for problems through mutual aid or organizing tenants or organizing workers around things that we know keep people safe.
Oh, thanks.
Does the DC Justice Lab have a website?
We do. It's dcjusticelab.org.
Okay.
And it's being revamped now. So even if you check back in a couple of weeks, you'll see more information about our individual campaigns, but you can keep up with our events, a lot of the conversations that are happening in the news. And we have really cool merch too, if you're interested.
You were asked to share your Instagram handle, I guess, if you can.
That was the wrong, I mistyped it. Give me one more chance.
Okay, great. There's another topic that I would love you to talk about a little bit, is about the future of the DC jail itself. That certainly was the recommendation of the Jails and Justice Task Force. Where do you see that going? I mean, the mayor it seems the mayor put in her budget something for an annex, she called it, and not necessarily rebuilding the whole jail. And it's not clear exactly, I know the Jails and Justice Task Force had a vision about how the architecture or the design of the jail should reflect a certain need for programming, and that programming shouldn't have to fit into how it's designed afterhand. So I was just wondering how you see all that playing out.
Thank you for bringing that up. Just by way of background for folks, this time last year during the budget hearings, we asked council members to ask the director of the Department of Corrections at that time, who was Quincy Booth, ask him about this new jail. He was on the Jails and Justice Task Force. Ask him, about this plan for a new jail within the next 10 years. And a council member did that, and he laughed in her face as if it was like not actually something that was going to happen, that it was just pie in the sky. And here we are a year later, after having brought attention to all of the horrific conditions inside the jail, including the overuse of solitary confinement. And it's only through that pressure that I think we saw a commitment from this administration to say, all right, we'll build an annex on the central treatment facility, which is the less horrible version of a jail that we have, and we'll close the really horrible version of a jail that we have, which would be an improvement, though not a permanent solution to some of the problems we have here. Our ask for DC government, as an organization led by someone who's not very excited about the idea of participating in the design of a cage, our position has been, if there's going to be a new jail or an annex, what DC should do is convene people who have lived in the current facility and let them help develop the request for proposals. That is like the call for bids, the call for contracts from people who are going to design this thing, and let them develop a request for proposals that assigns points to things like your plans for involving community in the development of this design, your insistence on building something that will work in a circular economy so we can repurpose this jail as we decarcerate, your understanding of what it's like to build a dormitory or independent living facility, as opposed to just assigning points to how strong a lock do you know how to build. And our request for DC government to set aside money to do that went nowhere. And what we're going to do instead is hold that convening ourselves. And so hopefully in the coming weeks, you'll hear from us about a date to have people who are returning citizens who have lived inside DC jail, and bring them together with people who have expertise in architecture and other spaces that I know very little about, and help them develop a plan for building a space that's more healing and more inviting of the kind of programmatic improvements that you're talking about.
Well, good luck. I guess my own feeling about all that is that until there's some really strong political leadership, nothing's really going to happen. And that's what, my experience with the parole issue is just that nothing has happened with that, and a whole group of volunteers. And I know there were significant differences of opinion about how that should be designed, but in any case, there was a whole group of volunteers who worked on it, and it was totally ignored.
Yeah, and even where there was disagreement, Rabbi, there were some folks who wanted one approach and some folks that wanted another approach, but everybody agreed we need an approach, right? Like,
exactly.
please don't split this baby in half. Please keep it alive and like do one thing or the other. And it shouldn't take that much political courage to do it.
The upshot of it is that they paid some consulting firm, has no experience with criminal justice at all, and certainly not with corrections, to design, to come up with a parole, some kind of program or design for a parole board. And it's just, talk about really pissing people off. That was
it's so
a big way. It just blew off all these advocates who really put a tremendous amount of time into it and had a vision for it. And of course, and instead of just saying, okay, we're going to do it, and then we'll work out the details as we go on, and obviously compromises will be made. It just totally ignored everyone. And so you're going to get this group together. I really worry about them becoming even more jaded if they're just totally blown off, and more cynical about politics here. And I guess that's the most disturbing thing about all of this, is that it's so easy to become cynical here when the politicians just seem to get away with ducking on this issue over and over again. So I'm sorry I got on my soapbox here. So,
no, I appreciate that point a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, more comments or questions? I think I've got my agenda. I think I've touched on all the things I'm interested in at the moment. So anybody else?
Hey, Rabbi, it's Kimberly.
Hi, Kimberly.
I just want to say, Patrice, awesome presentation. And also the information you provided, reference Second Look, was very informative. And I will be following up, because in Virginia, we are addressing Second Looks, predominantly the way you described the process that you guys are using for the BOP. So great presentation, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to find ways to collaborate more with people doing great work in Virginia and Maryland. I'm so impressed with how Rabbi Feinberg has been able to do amazing things in all three places. I really don't know how that works. I feel overwhelmed with just DC.
Yes.
So yeah.
It is challenging at times. Lots of balls in the air at the same time. Yeah, that's for sure.
I appreciate it. I mean, you are such an example of the strong leadership that you're talking about, right? It doesn't just have to be the politicians. It really is making a difference what you're doing every day. And
thank you for that. Appreciate that. Okay, Kimberly Jenkins Snodgrass is actually both our past chair and now vice chair. So has been a real force in our organization over the last 5-6 years. So great that she's online today. So if there's no more questions or comments, I think I'll bring this to a close. I want to be cognizant of people's time. So I really appreciate, Patrice, for your taking the time for making your presentation and for answering our questions and commenting on our comments as well. So really, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to working with you in the many different ways.
thank you. Likewise.
One of the things I think we'll be working with you is on the end of isolation tour this summer, which, by the way, is this play that's going to be being produced and being brought around the country, and it's coming to Baltimore and DC in August. And we'll be involved in promoting it here, both in Baltimore and in DC. So we look forward to that as well. So, so I wish everyone a very good night, and hang in there, everybody.
Also, Patrice just shared the link to the End of Isolation tour in the chat, just for those of you that want to check it out, exactly what it is. It's in the chat, the last link that she shared.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks so much. We'll be
All
signing
right, have
off
a good
now.
evening.
Yeah,
All right.
you too.